Welcome, dear friends, to a journey through the timeless story of Captain America. Tonight, we will drift through the origins of a hero who embodies courage, sacrifice, and the very spirit of justice. From a frail young man in Brooklyn to the indomitable symbol of freedom, Captain America's legacy is woven into the fabric of history itself. Together, we'll explore his transformation through the super soldier serum, his battles against the forces of Hydra, and the deep bonds he shares with friends like Bucky Barnes. As the world changes around him, so too does the hero we come to know. From the shadows of war to the challenges of a modern world, Captain America stands as a beacon of hope, an enduring reminder that the heart of a hero is never bound by time. Now, as we begin this gentle journey, allow your body to settle into comfort. With each slow breath, feel the weight of the day lift. Let your mind drift softly, as though you are floating between worlds. Relax, release, and feel the calm spread through you. And if you enjoy stories like this one, you're welcome to subscribe and softly tell me where you're listening from tonight. As we begin, let us ease into the tale of a hero who never truly sleeps, for his story lives on forever. In the heart of Brooklyn, during the early years of World War II, there was a young man named Steve Rogers. He wasn't tall, he wasn't strong, and he certainly didn't stand out in a crowd. What he had, however, was an unyielding desire to serve his country, a passion for justice, and a heart that was pure. Steve had always dreamed of being more, of being someone who could make a difference in a world torn apart by war. Yet no matter how hard he tried, his physical limitations held him back. He wasn't the athlete or the soldier others were. The world around him seemed to race ahead while he remained behind, a weak and sickly figure, unable to enlist in the military, always rejected by the recruiters who saw him as unfit for battle. Despite being rejected the time and time again, Steve's resolve remained unwavering. His determination to fight for his country was more powerful than his frail frame. His heart longed for a chance to prove that he was more than the body he had been given. His spirit was undeterred, and that spirit, that fire within him, would soon set him on a path that would change not only his life, but the world itself. In the midst of his struggles, Steve met a man who would alter the course of history. Dr. Abraham Erskine, a scientist working on a secret government project, saw something in Steve that no one else could: a deep goodness, an unwavering moral compass. To Erskine, Steve wasn't just a young man desperate for a chance. He was a man whose heart was strong enough to bear the weight of great power. After many trials and tests, Steve was selected to undergo the procedure that would change everything: the super soldier serum. The serum was designed to enhance the human body to its peak potential, to make the soldier stronger, faster, and more capable than anyone before. But the serum came with risks. Its success had never been guaranteed, and many who had tried the experiment before had either failed or died. Yet in Steve, there was a hope that transcended the science, hope that perhaps this man could carry the mantle of greatness without losing the very essence of who he was. The procedure was grueling, but Steve's transformation was nothing short of miraculous. He became taller, stronger, faster. His body was honed into perfection, every muscle sculpted to the ideal. His transformation wasn't just physical, however. Steve's heart and mind, which had always been full of compassion and selflessness, became even sharper. It was as if the serum had unlocked a deeper connection to his true purpose, something beyond just fighting. It allowed him to embody the virtues of a hero, a symbol of hope in a time of darkness. Yet, even as his body was transformed into a weapon, Steve's soul remained untouched. Where others might have faltered under the weight of such power, Steve Rogers held on to his integrity. His character remained steadfast, untainted by the forces that often corrupted those who sought great power. This was what made Steve Rogers different from all the others who had come before him. He wasn't just a super soldier, he was a man whose heart would never stray from what was right. The first test of his new abilities came sooner than expected. Armed with nothing but his resolve, Steve joined the Howling Commandos, a group of elite soldiers tasked with missions deep behind enemy lines. It was here that Steve proved himself not just as a symbol of strength, but as a leader, someone who could inspire those around him with his courage and conviction. Though the battles were fierce, Steve always led with a steady hand. His heart guided him, and his actions spoke louder than any words could. Every mission, every battle, was a step toward becoming the man he had always dreamed of being, not just a soldier, but a hero. Yet even in the face of victory, there were losses. Steve's life would never be without pain, and the price of heroism was high. One of those losses came when his closest companion, Bucky Barnes, was lost in battle. Bucky had been Steve's brother in arms, his friend through thick and thin. The two had been inseparable, their bond unbreakable, like two halves of the same whole. When Bucky fell, Steve was left to face the weight of the world alone. The pain of losing someone so dear to him would be a wound that would never fully heal. But Steve never gave up. Even in the darkest of moments, when the pain threatened to overtake him, he pressed forward. He held onto his mission and his beliefs. The world needed him, and he would never stop fighting for what was right, even if it meant facing his deepest fears, even if it meant walking through darkness alone. Steve Rogers would stand tall, a symbol of what it meant to never give up. As the war raged on, Steve's journey was far from over. The transformation that had begun in the lab was only the first step of what would become a lifetime of challenges, sacrifices, and triumphs. And while he had become Captain America, the man he was, the man who had fought so hard to become the hero he was still just a man, shaped by his past, driven by his unwavering moral compass. The legacy of Steve Rogers, of Captain America, would go on to inspire generations. It was not just his strength or his shield that made him a hero, but his ability to always choose the right path, no matter the cost. And in the end, it was his heart, the very thing that had made him so different from the rest, that would forever define who he was. It was a day that would forever change the course of history. The super soldier serum had been perfected, at least in theory, by Dr. Abraham Erskine, a man whose quiet brilliance would lay the foundation for the greatest hero the world would ever know. But the serum itself was more than just science. It was hope, bottled and distilled into an elixir that could elevate a mere man to the status of something greater, a symbol of strength, resilience, and justice. The world was in turmoil. War had spread across the globe, and every corner of the earth seemed to be consumed by violence, suffering, and fear. Nations were at war, and soldiers were sent into battle with little hope of returning home. In these dark days, The need for a hero was more pressing than ever. But who could stand as the symbol of hope? Who could embody the courage necessary to inspire others in such a hopeless time? It was in this context that Dr. Erskine found Steve Rogers, a man whose heart burned with an unrelenting desire to fight for what was right, even though his body could not keep up with his spirit. Steve was frail and sickly, a figure who seemed out of place in the army. Yet it was precisely his purity of heart that caught the attention of Erskine, who believed that true strength did not lie solely in physical might, but in the character of the person wielding it. Erskine saw something in Steve that he didn't see in others, a goodness that could withstand the weight of power. The serum, however, was not without its risks. It had never been tested on a subject as weak as Steve. The earlier attempts to perfect the serum had ended in failure with disastrous consequences. But Dr. Erskine, with his deep understanding of the human condition, believed that Steve was the right person. For Erskine, the serum wasn't just a means of enhancing physical abilities, it was a test of the soul. And Steve's soul was strong enough to bear the transformation. The day Steve received the serum was unlike any other. It was a process filled with uncertainty, as his body was injected with a powerful mixture of chemicals that would alter his very being. He lay on the table, tense but determined, feeling the cold needle pierce his skin, knowing that this could either be the beginning of a new life or the end of everything he had ever known. The serum coursed through him, and in that moment, his frail body began to change. Steve's muscles expanded, his frame grew taller and broader. The sickly appearance that had haunted him for so long melted away as his body became the epitome of strength and grace. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous, yet it wasn't just his physical appearance that changed. His senses became sharper, his mind clearer, and his heart more attuned to the world around him. His ability to endure pain, to persevere through hardship, was now beyond human. His physical limitations were gone, replaced by the strength of someone who could go toe to toe with the most formidable foes. But in the midst of this transformation, Steve's character remained intact. Unlike the previous subjects who had failed, Steve's heart did not change. He remained grounded, humble, and focused on the greater good. In the face of such power, it was his unwavering moral compass that kept him on the path of heroism. The serum had created a new soldier, but it was Steve's soul that defined him. In the days that followed, Steve found himself tested in ways he had never imagined. The serum had transformed him physically, but it had also transformed the world around him. He was no longer the man he had been, the small, sickly boy who could barely stand up straight. He was a symbol of strength, a symbol of hope. His every movement, every decision carried the weight of his new role. No longer could he be an observer to the battles of the world. He was now a participant, a leader. Yet with this newfound power came responsibility. Steve understood that the serum had not just changed his body, it had elevated his purpose. He had become a soldier not just in a war, but for a cause much greater than himself. His strength was now a tool to protect those who could not protect themselves, to fight against the darkness that consumed the world. But even as he embraced this new life, he never forgot where he had come from. His humility was as strong as his new body, and his moral compass was always true. As Steve took his first steps as a super soldier, He was not alone. He was soon joined by others who would become his closest allies, each of them a reflection of the strength and courage that he embodied. Together, they would form a bond that would withstand the test of time, a bond that would be tested in battle, in friendship, and in loss. And yet, no matter the obstacles they faced, Steve would always be the heart of their mission, the one who led them with unwavering determination and a heart full of compassion. But for Steve, the greatest challenge lay ahead. The war was still raging, and the forces of evil, led by the sinister Red Skull, were growing stronger. Captain America would face battles unlike any he had encountered before, and the stakes would be higher than ever. But even as the world around him grew darker, Steve Rogers stood tall, his shield held high, ready to fight for the ideals that he had always believed in. Through it all, the serum had made Steve Rogers into Captain America, but it was his heart, the heart of a hero, that would carry him through the darkness. The world was about to see that there was more to strength than just muscles and power. There was a heart that beat with the determination to never give up, no matter the odds. The dawn of Captain America's journey as a hero came quickly, as the world, in all its turmoil, had no time to wait. The first great test of his strength and resolve would come at the hands of one of his most dangerous adversaries, the Red Skull, a man whose thirst for power was as unrelenting as the darkest forces of evil. Johann Schmidt, the Red Skull, was a man who believed that the world should be reshaped according to his twisted vision, and to achieve that, he would stop at nothing, including unleashing an army of terror upon the world. The first encounter between Captain America and Red Skull set the stage for a battle that would last for years. The Red Skull was not just a threat to the allies of the war effort. He was a symbol of everything Captain America stood against. Where Captain America believed in freedom, justice, and the power of the human spirit, Red Skull embodied the opposite: tyranny, fear, and the dehumanization of those who stood in his way. The battle between them was more than just a clash of fists and weapons. It was a war of ideologies, a contest for the very soul of the world. It was in the heart of Europe that their paths first crossed. Steve, now Captain America, had already begun to make a name for himself in the battlefield. His transformation into the super soldier had made him the ultimate weapon against the forces of evil, and his bravery had inspired many soldiers to follow his lead. But even with his enhanced strength and speed, Captain America was still only one man. The weight of the war was heavy, and every mission felt like a step further into the unknown. Yet he pressed on, driven by the knowledge that the world was depending on him. The first major confrontation came when Captain America's forces were tasked with taking down an important Hydra stronghold, a key base in the Red Skull's campaign. The mission seemed simple enough, but as Captain America and his howling commandos made their way through the enemy lines, they quickly realized that Hydra was not only entrenched in the physical world, but was also using advanced weaponry that pushed the boundaries of what they thought possible. The Red Skull's plans were far more elaborate than they had imagined, and it soon became clear that the stakes were higher than ever. When Captain America first laid eyes on the Red Skull, it was like facing a nightmare made flesh. The Skull's face, twisted into a hideous mask of hate, reflected the deep corruption within him. He had no loyalty to any nation or cause but his own twisted ambitions. His goals were clear: to conquer the world by any means necessary, to remake it in his own image, and to destroy anyone who dared to stand in his way. What made the Red Skull even more dangerous was his weapon, the Tesseract, a source of immense power. This ancient, otherworldly object would be the key to his control over the world, a force that could alter the very fabric of reality itself. Its power was unmatched, and Captain America knew that if the Red Skull were allowed to harness it, the consequences would be disastrous. The war that had already taken so many lives would pale in comparison to the destruction that could unfold. The battle between Captain America and the Red Skull was not just one of brawn, but of willpower. Captain America's shield, his most trusted companion, clashed against the Red Skull's weapons and forces. Every strike, every maneuver was a testament to Steve Rogers' strength, not just as a soldier, but as a man who understood the value of freedom, of choice, and of selflessness. He was a beacon of hope in a world that was slowly losing its light. But as the battle raged on, it became clear that the Red Skull was not an adversary easily defeated. The Red Skull had no qualms about using the Tesseract's power for his own gain, wielding its energy as if it were an extension of his will. With each move, the battle became more intense, the stakes higher, as Captain America fought to prevent the Red Skull from completing his mission and unleashing the horrors that lay hidden within the Tesseract. Through it all, Captain America never wavered. He fought not just for the freedom of his country, but for the freedom of every man, woman, and child who had ever been oppressed. He fought not just for victory, but for the belief that good would always triumph over evil, no matter how insurmountable the odds seemed. And even when faced with the greatest of threats, Captain America remained unyielding, a shining light in the darkest of times. It was during this first major confrontation that Captain America truly embraced his role as a leader, not just of soldiers, but of the ideals that defined the very essence of heroism. He knew that he could not fight alone, and he inspired others to rise alongside him. His bond with his team, the Howling Commandos, grew stronger as they shared in the fight for a better world. And through their collective strength, they were able to overcome the Red Skull's forces and put an end to his first attempt at global domination. But while the battle was won, the war was far from over. The Red Skull was not the only threat that Captain America would face. There were still many battles to be fought, many villains to be defeated, and many lives to be saved. Captain America had become more than just a soldier. He had become a symbol, a beacon of hope in a world that desperately needed it. As the war continued, Captain America's journey would only grow more complicated. His bond with his friends would be tested, and his own inner struggles would surface in ways he never expected. But no matter the challenges he faced, Captain America would remain steadfast in his mission to fight for justice, for freedom, and for the belief that in the end, good would always prevail. In the midst of war, friendships forged through fire often became as powerful as the weapons carried into battle. For Captain America, one such bond was with Bucky Barnes, his closest friend and ally since their childhood in Brooklyn. Bucky was the older, more confident counterpart to Steve's frailty, the one who stood by him through thick and thin. even when Steve wasn't yet the towering figure of strength he would become. It was Bucky who helped Steve find his courage when the world seemed too harsh and unforgiving, and it was Bucky who believed in Steve when no one else would. The Howling Commandos, a group of elite soldiers assembled for special missions during World War II, would become Steve's second family. Among them was Bucky, a fellow soldier who would rise to become Captain America's right hand. Together, they led the charge into the heart of enemy territory, taking on missions that were deemed impossible, relying on each other's strengths to survive. The bond between them was one of the strongest in Steve's life. Bucky wasn't just a comrade, he was a brother, and that relationship would be tested time and time again as the war took its toll. The Howling Commandos were a diverse group, each member bringing their own unique skills and backgrounds to the team. There was Dum Dum Dugan, a fearless and barrel chested soldier who commanded respect with his sheer presence. Gabe Jones, whose calm and collected demeanor proved invaluable in high stress situations. And the sharpshooter, the ever quiet, calculating Jim Morita. Together, they formed a crack team of operatives capable of completing the most dangerous and covert missions behind enemy lines. Yet it was the leadership of Captain America and his unwavering trust in his team that bound them together as more than just soldiers. They became a family, and their loyalty to one another transcended mere camaraderie. It was under Steve's leadership that the Howling Commandos became known for their success in seemingly impossible missions. The team was tasked with infiltrating and dismantling Hydra strongholds, sabotaging enemy weapons, and gathering critical intelligence. While each mission was perilous, Captain America and his team always fought as one, never allowing personal interests or fear to cloud their focus. The bond they shared allowed them to accomplish feats that others would consider impossible, and they quickly gained a reputation as a formidable force against Hydra's growing power. But it wasn't just the missions that strengthened the bond between Steve and his team. It was the shared experiences, the quiet moments between battles, where they could relax and reflect on the weight of the world they were fighting to save. These small moments were the ones that defined their unity, for in the chaos of war, they knew they could rely on one another. Bucky, in particular, was Steve's anchor. Even as Captain America's fame grew, Bucky remained a constant reminder of the man Steve had once been, the fragile, unsure young man from Brooklyn. In Bucky's presence, Steve didn't feel like a symbol. He felt like a friend, a brother, and that was a feeling he desperately needed. However, as the war raged on, tragedy was never far behind. Captain America's greatest fear would soon come true. It was during one of their most dangerous missions, deep in enemy territory, that Bucky would face a fate that Steve could not have anticipated. While the Howling Commandos worked to secure an important Hydra weapon, Bucky was separated from the group. In the chaos of the mission, he fell from a moving train, disappearing into the icy wilderness below. It was a loss that would haunt Steve for the rest of his life. Despite his heroic efforts to search for Bucky, Steve was unable to find him, and the thought of losing his closest friend, his brother in arms, left a wound in Steve's heart that would never fully heal. Captain America's mission was now more than just about defeating Hydra or winning the war. It became personal. The loss of Bucky served as a reminder of the true cost of heroism. Even as Steve grew stronger as Captain America became a symbol of hope. He knew that the battle would always be complicated by the price of war, the friends lost along the way, and the sacrifices made. The emotional weight of losing Bucky would shape Steve in ways that even his physical transformation could not. The journey he had begun as a young man, desperate to prove his worth, had now become something much deeper. He was no longer just a soldier in a war. He was a man who had experienced loss, grief, and heartbreak, and that pain became a part of him. It was in these moments of vulnerability that Steve began to truly understand the nature of sacrifice, that even in the face of overwhelming power, the real strength came from the heart and the ability to endure the hardships that came with being a hero. Even in the darkest moments, when it seemed as though all hope was lost, Steve never gave up. The memory of Bucky's bravery, the bond they shared, and the sacrifices made in the name of something greater than themselves pushed Steve forward. He fought not just for victory, but for the honor of those who had fallen, for the hope that one day Bucky would be found and the war would end with the freedom they had all fought for. Though Captain America's path would continue, the loss of Bucky Barnes would remain a central part of his story. It was a loss that would echo through every battle, every mission, and every moment of doubt. And yet, in the memory of his fallen friend, Steve found strength. Bucky had never truly been lost. His spirit, his memory, lived on in the very heart of the hero that Captain America had become. The war had no mercy, and neither did the cold grasp of fate. When Bucky Barnes fell from the train and disappeared into the icy chasm below, it was not just the loss of a soldier or a comrade. It was the loss of a brother, a bond forged over years of friendship and shared experiences, a connection that had withstood the harshest tests. For Steve Rogers, the loss of Bucky was the moment when the full weight of war's cruel realities became unbearable. The world, which had once felt full of potential and hope, now seemed to be shadowed by the absence of his friend. In the moments after Bucky's fall, Steve's heart felt heavy, as if something deep within him had been torn away. The pain of loss was unlike anything he had ever known. Even though the world around him raged with the fury of war, Steve's thoughts were consumed by the one person who had always been by his side. He could still hear Bucky's laughter, still feel the weight of his hand on his shoulder, and remember the promise they had made to one another. No matter what, they would always be there for each other. Yet now, in the harsh aftermath of battle, Steve was left to face the world alone. It was a wound that never healed, not entirely. The pain of losing Bucky was something that would stay with Steve for the rest of his life. But it was more than just the grief of loss. It was the haunting feeling that despite his super soldier strength and the shield that had come to symbolize his unwavering will, he was still powerless to save the one person who had been his closest friend. And that feeling, the deep, gnawing sense of helplessness, was what would shape Captain America's heart for years to come. In the aftermath of the fall, Steve did what any soldier would do. He buried his grief, for there was no time to mourn in the middle of a war. The fight against Hydra and the forces of evil was far from over. The world needed Captain America, and the battle raged on. Yet no matter how hard he tried to focus on the mission, Bucky's memory lingered, casting a shadow over every victory, every new challenge, and every day Steve spent fighting. The loss was always there, just beneath the surface, a constant reminder of what had been taken from him. But even as the pain of loss remained, Steve pushed forward. He honored Bucky's memory by continuing the fight, knowing that his friend would have done the same. The war had claimed so many lives, and every soldier lost left a mark on Steve. Yet it was Bucky's absence that was the heaviest of all. The man who had been his equal, his partner, was gone, and Steve was left to carry on, fighting for a world that had taken so much from him. Over time, Steve's grief evolved. It did not fade, but it became a part of him, a quiet ache that never truly went away. He learned to carry it, to turn it into the fuel that kept him moving forward. He would never forget Bucky. He would never stop hoping that one day he would find his friend again. But until that moment came, Steve knew that he could not let the darkness of grief consume him. He had a duty to fulfill, and the world needed him more than ever. As the years passed, Steve found himself standing alone more often than he cared to admit. Even though he had a team, even though he had allies, there was always a part of him that felt incomplete. The war had taken so much, and the loss of Bucky was a wound that had never fully closed. He had become Captain America, the symbol of hope and justice, but deep down, Steve Rogers was still just a man who had lost his best friend, a man who had experienced the true cost of war. But the world did not stop for grief. The battles continued, and the enemies grew stronger. Hydra's influence was still spreading, and Steve could feel the weight of the war pushing against him. It was a constant reminder that there was no time for sorrow, no time to stop and heal. Every mission, every fight was a reminder that the world needed him, that the sacrifices of those who had fallen were not in vain. And so, with the memory of Bucky's sacrifice ever in his heart, Steve pressed on. Though Steve never stopped mourning Bucky, he understood that the best way to honor his friend's memory was to continue the fight, to be the hero that Bucky would have wanted him to be. And so, Captain America continued his quest for justice, battling Hydra, protecting the innocent, and ensuring that the sacrifices of those who had fallen would never be forgotten. But in the quiet moments, when the world was still, Steve would remember his fallen friend. He would remember the times they had shared, the battles they had fought side by side, and the promise they had made to each other. And though Bucky was gone, Steve's love for him and the memory of their bond would never fade. It was a love that transcended death, a love that would endure even in the darkest of times. In the end, Captain America's story was not just about the battles he fought or the victories he achieved. It was about the people he loved, the sacrifices he made, and the memories that shaped him. And even though Bucky Barnes was gone, his spirit lived on in the heart of the hero who had never stopped believing in the power of friendship, loyalty, and love. The tale of Captain America's journey took an unexpected turn the day Steve Rogers was lost to the cold embrace of the Arctic. After his brave sacrifice to stop a Hydra plane carrying a deadly weapon, Steve plunged into the icy waters, his shield still clenched tightly in his hand. The world believed him to be lost, a hero whose light had flickered out too soon. The war had been won, but at a great cost, and the man who had symbolized hope, strength, and unwavering courage seemed destined to be forgotten. Yet fate had other plans. The very thing that had once brought Steve to the edge of death would now become the catalyst for his rebirth. Encased in ice, Frozen in time, Steve Rogers remained preserved in a state of suspended animation. The world moved forward, but Captain America remained a relic of a bygone era, a forgotten figure from the past. It was as if time itself had paused, holding him in place, waiting for the right moment to awaken him once more. For decades, the world continued to evolve without Captain America. The war he had fought so valiantly to end had left its scars, and new threats arose as the world entered the Cold War era. The political landscape shifted, and new heroes and villains emerged to fill the void left by the absence of the super soldier. Yet, despite the passage of time, Steve's legacy remained, embedded in the hearts and minds of those who had witnessed his heroism. In the icy depths of the Arctic, Steve's body remained, a silent witness to the passage of time. The world had forgotten the hero who had once stood at the forefront of battle, but his story had not yet ended. The serum that had transformed him, the power that had made him into Captain America, was more than just a physical enhancement. It was a force that kept him alive, even in the harshest conditions. Then the moment came. After decades of slumber, Steve was discovered by SHIELD, led by Nick Fury, who recognized the potential of the man frozen in time. The discovery of Steve Rogers was nothing short of miraculous. The world had changed so much since his fall, but the ideals that Steve stood for had not. His shield, though battered, remained as powerful a symbol as ever, an unyielding testament to the man who had once wielded it with such grace and strength. Awakening in a new era, Steve was disoriented. The world he once knew was no longer the same. The faces had changed, the cities had evolved, and the wars that had once consumed him had faded into history. He was no longer the young man from Brooklyn, full of dreams and ambition. He was an artifact from the past, a man out of time, struggling to find his place in a world that had moved on without him. The world of the 21st century was a far cry from the one Steve had left behind. Technology had advanced, and society had shifted in ways that were both exciting and alien to him. There was no longer a single clear enemy to face, no simple battle between good and evil. Instead, the world was full of complexity, with new challenges emerging in unexpected places. Steve had to learn how to navigate this new world, to adapt to the times, even as he clung to the values that had defined him as Captain America. But even as the world had changed, Steve's core beliefs remained unwavering. His sense of justice, his desire to protect the innocent, and his commitment to freedom and equality had not been eroded by time. These ideals were just as relevant in the modern world as they had been during the war. And so, despite his disorientation and the profound sense of loss that came with being displaced in time, Steve Rogers found his way back to his calling, to be a hero, to stand up for those who could not stand up for themselves, and to fight for the greater good. As Steve navigated the challenges of his new life, he was also confronted with the profound emotional toll of being separated from everything he had once known. The friends he had fought alongside, the world he had fought to protect, all of it seemed like a distant memory. The burden of having been frozen in time, of having missed so much, weighed heavily on him. He found it difficult to reconcile the man he had been with the man he had become. Yet in the face of this internal struggle, Steve found solace in his mission. His purpose as Captain America was as clear as ever. He was a symbol, a protector of the innocent, and a defender of freedom. In a world full of new threats, Steve was determined to make a difference once more. Even though the world around him was unrecognizable, his commitment to doing what was right remained unchanged. His return to the modern world was not without its challenges. The people who remembered him were few, and many had forgotten the significance of Captain America's sacrifice. There were new heroes in the world, and the mantle of heroism was now shared by many. But Steve did not seek recognition or glory. His return was not about reclaiming the title of Captain America. It was about continuing the fight, about standing up for the values that had always guided him, no matter the cost. As he slowly adapted to the modern world, Steve found new allies, new friends who understood the weight of his legacy and the power of his example. These new heroes, including Iron Man, Thor, and the rest of the Avengers, became his new family, a team that would fight alongside him to protect the world from threats both old and new. Together, they would stand united against forces that threatened to undo the progress of the world, and together they would ensure that the ideals of freedom, justice, and hope would endure. Steve Rogers, the man frozen in time, had returned to a world that needed him more than ever. His journey was far from over, and though the world had changed, his heart had not. The fight for justice, for freedom, for what was right would continue as long as Captain America was there to stand in the way of tyranny. The world had moved on. The battles were different, the threats evolved, and the heroes who once stood shoulder to shoulder in a world war were now scattered, each finding their place in a world that seemed both familiar and foreign. But Steve Rogers was still Captain America, a man frozen in time, brought back to life in an era that did not understand him. The transition from one world to another was jarring for Steve. He had been a symbol of hope, of strength, of freedom in the darkest days of World War II. But now, in the 21st century, he was a relic of a bygone era, unsure of where he fit in the modern age. It was difficult for Steve to comprehend how much had changed while he had been lost to the cold embrace of the Arctic. The faces were new, the technology was beyond his imagination, and the wars were no longer confined to the battlefields of Europe. It was a world that seemed disconnected from the one he had once fought to protect. The stark contrast between the chaos of his past and the complexity of his present left him feeling adrift, a man out of place in a time he didn't recognize. Yet despite the disorientation and the challenge of adjusting to a new world, one thing remained constant: Steve's dedication to doing what was right. No matter how much the world had changed, his core beliefs had not. He had always fought for freedom, justice, and the protection of the innocent, and those values were just as important now as they had been during the war. He may have been out of place in this new world, but the need for heroes had not diminished. The world still needed Captain America. Steve's return to active duty began with an introduction to a new generation of heroes. The Avengers, a group of extraordinary individuals with powers and abilities beyond ordinary men and women, were the new champions of justice. They, too, had been brought together by a need to protect the world from rising threats. But they were far different from the soldiers Steve had once fought alongside. They were a diverse group, made up of scientists, gods, and soldiers, each with their own struggles, fears, and experiences. But despite the differences that separated them, they were united by a common cause. For Steve, the challenge was not just about finding his place among these new heroes, but about reconnecting with the world he had left behind. In the years since his disappearance, the world had shifted in ways that he couldn't fully grasp. The very fabric of society had been altered, with new technologies and ideologies reshaping the way people interacted, communicated, and even fought. The geopolitical landscape was no longer defined by clear cut lines between good and evil. There were no longer simple battles to be fought, no singular enemy to face. Instead, the challenges had become far more complex, and the battles had become internal as much as they were external. But one thing Steve had learned throughout his life was that heroes were not defined by the times they lived in, but by their actions and their commitment to doing what was right. Even though the world had changed, Steve knew that his role as Captain America was not just about fighting enemies. It was about standing for something greater than himself. It was about being a beacon of hope in a world that had lost its way, about inspiring others to rise to the challenges they faced, just as he had done during the darkest days of the war. His awakening in this new era brought with it a wave of responsibility. Captain America was no longer just a symbol of wartime patriotism. He had become a universal symbol of heroism. His actions would be scrutinized by the world, and his every decision would have consequences. And yet, despite the weight of this new responsibility, Steve never wavered. He remained committed to the ideals that had made him who he was, a man who believed in the power of freedom, justice, and the strength of the human spirit. The Avengers quickly recognized Steve's value as a leader. His experience, his wisdom, and his unwavering moral compass made him the natural choice to guide them in their mission. But being a leader in a new era was different from leading men into battle during the war. The Avengers were not just soldiers, they were a team of unique individuals, each with their own strengths, weaknesses, and personalities. Steve had to learn how to lead in a way that fostered cooperation, respect, and trust. His strength wasn't just in his physical abilities, but in his ability to bring people together, to inspire them to fight for something greater than themselves. Through it all, Steve found solace in the camaraderie of his new team. Though they were different from the howling commandos he had led in the past, they shared the same ideals. They fought together for the same purpose, to protect the world from threats both seen and unseen. It was a bond that transcended time, a reminder that heroes would always rise to answer the call when the world needed them most. But even as Steve embraced his new role as a member of the Avengers, there were still moments when he felt the weight of his past. He had lost so much, not just his time, but his friends, his memories, and the world he had once known. The faces of those he had fought alongside were no longer there, and the world he had protected no longer existed in the way he remembered. It was a loneliness that seemed to linger even in the presence of others. And yet, despite this loneliness, Steve never lost sight of his purpose. He had become Captain America, not just to fight, but to stand as a symbol of hope in a world that often seemed lost. As Steve continued to fight alongside the Avengers, he also began to piece together the fractured memories of his past. His mind, though shaped by his years of service, was still haunted by the ghosts of those he had lost: Bucky, Peggy, and so many others who had once been a part of his life. Yet in the midst of this sorrow, Steve found something powerful: the realization that the fight was never truly over. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, the spirit of heroism, the desire to protect others, and to fight for what was right, would always live on. Captain America had returned to a new world, but he had not returned alone. He carried with him the legacy of those who had come before him, the lessons learned from his past, and the unshakable belief that no matter the time or place, the heart of a hero would always beat strong. As Captain America stepped into the modern world, his new role as a hero was intricately tied to the covert organization that had once operated in the shadows of war, SHIELD. After his awakening from decades of suspended animation, Steve Rogers found himself face to face with the agency that had evolved from wartime operations into an international peacekeeping force. SHIELD had become the shield against new, unseen threats, but Steve's place within it was far from certain. Nick Fury, the man who led SHIELD, was an enigmatic figure who had his own reasons for seeing Steve brought into the fold. Fury recognized Steve for what he truly was: a leader, a symbol, and a man whose sense of duty transcended time itself. Fury knew that the modern world, with its rising threats and complicated geopolitical dynamics, needed a leader like Captain America. Though Steve had been frozen in time, his instincts as a soldier, his knowledge of strategy, and his unwavering moral compass made him an invaluable asset in this new era of combat. When Steve first joined SHIELD, it was not with the same sense of certainty that had defined his past missions. In the face of unfamiliar technology, new global politics, and the shifting tides of power, Steve often felt like an outsider. The world he had once known, where the battle between good and evil seemed so clear-cut, now seemed murky. The line between right and wrong was not as simple as it had once been, and the stakes were higher than ever. Despite the unfamiliarity of his new surroundings, Steve's place within SHIELD quickly became more defined. The agency's resources, advanced technology, and intelligence operations provided him with the tools to fight new types of enemies, not just the physical threats of war, but the shadowy organizations, criminal syndicates, and rogue states that threatened the stability of the world. His work with SHIELD was not just about combat. It was about navigating the delicate balance of diplomacy, intelligence, and action. As Captain America, Steve's role had expanded far beyond the battlefield. Now, he was tasked with not just fighting, but with thinking strategically about how to confront the emerging threats to global security. In this new world, the threats were often more elusive than the ones Steve had fought in the past. There were no more obvious faces of evil like Hydra's Red Skull or the Nazi regime. Instead, the enemies were often hidden in the shadows, operating through covert means, manipulating governments, corporations, and individuals for their own agendas. Steve found himself fighting against not just physical enemies, but also against ideologies that sought to undermine the very principles he had once fought for. SHIELD's missions often took Steve into the heart of these complex situations. One of his first major assignments with the agency was to infiltrate and dismantle an emerging terrorist network that threatened to destabilize global peace. Unlike the battles of his past, this mission required more than just physical strength. Steve had to rely on the resources of SHIELD, its intelligence, technology, and global network of operatives to navigate the intricate web of deception and subterfuge that had taken root in the modern world. Throughout this mission, Steve found himself questioning not only the enemies he faced, but also the methods used to combat them. SHIELD's tactics were sometimes morally ambiguous, and Steve found it difficult to reconcile these strategies with the values he had once held dear. The world had changed, and so too had the nature of the fight. In the past, Steve had known who the enemy was and what he needed to do to defeat them. But in the modern world, the enemies were not always visible, and the lines between right and wrong were not always so clear. Despite these challenges, Steve's unwavering commitment to justice and his belief in the greater good kept him grounded. He understood that the world had evolved, and so too had the methods required to protect it. He didn't need to change who he was or what he stood for. He just needed to adapt to the new realities of a world that was far more complicated than the one he had left behind. It was a difficult adjustment, but Steve's strength of character and his deep-rooted sense of duty gave him the resolve to continue. Steve's integration into SHIELD was also marked by his growing relationships with the new generation of heroes. While many of them hid their own ideologies, struggles, and backgrounds, they all shared a common purpose. Together, they would form the Avengers, a team united by the belief that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, there was always hope, and there was always a need for people who would stand up for what was right. The Avengers, though made up of individuals with diverse abilities and backgrounds, quickly recognized Steve as the leader they needed. His experience, his wisdom, and his ability to make the difficult decisions set him apart as a natural leader. Even in the face of the most daunting threats, Steve never hesitated. His leadership was defined not just by his strength or his shield, but by his ability to inspire others to rise to the occasion, to work together for the greater good, and to believe that no challenge was too great to overcome. But leadership also came with its burdens. Steve often found himself at odds with his fellow Avengers, as each hero brought their own perspective to the table. The disagreements that arose were a reflection of the complexity of the modern world, a world where the lines between good and evil were blurred, and the choices faced by those in power were more difficult than ever. Yet through it all, Steve remained steadfast in his belief that doing the right thing, even when it was difficult, was always worth the cost. As Steve continued his work with SHIELD and the Avengers, he realized that his mission was far from over. The challenges of the modern world were unlike any he had faced before, but they were no less important. As Captain America, he would always stand as a symbol of the values he held dear: justice, freedom, and the power of hope. The world had changed, but the heart of a hero remained unchanged. And in that heart, Steve Rogers would continue to fight for the people he swore to protect, for the freedom he believed in, and for the legacy of those who had come before him. The formation of the Avengers marked a new chapter in Steve Rogers' journey, one that would bring together a diverse group of individuals, each with their own unique abilities, backgrounds, and perspectives. For Steve, the concept of a team was familiar. He had led the Howling Commandos through some of the most dangerous missions of World War II. But the Avengers were different. They were not just soldiers, they were heroes of a new age, each with their own sense of justice, their own reasons for fighting. When the call to form the Avengers came, it was not just a response to the growing threats around the world. It was also a recognition that in a world filled with so much complexity and uncertainty, the best chance for survival was unity. Steve understood this better than most. He knew that strength didn't just come from individual might, it came from working together, from sharing a common purpose and a collective vision. The Avengers were not just a team, they were a family brought together by a singular goal to protect the world from those who would seek to destroy it. The first battle of the Avengers was unlike anything Steve had faced before. The team had come together to combat the threat of Loki, the Asgardian god of mischief, who sought to enslave humanity using an army of alien invaders. Loki's plan was simple: to take control of Earth using the Tesseract, the powerful artifact that had once been wielded by the Red Skull, to open a portal through which the Chitauri army could invade. With the fate of the world hanging in the balance, the Avengers were the last line of defense against an enemy who was both cunning and powerful. For Steve, leading the Avengers in this battle was both a challenge and an opportunity. It was a new kind of war, one that demanded more than just physical strength. He had to find a way to unite individuals with vastly different skill sets and temperaments to bring them together for a common purpose. The Avengers were not just a group of soldiers, they were individuals with their own motivations, their own personal struggles. Tony Stark, the billionaire playboy with a genius level intellect and a suit of armor that made him nearly invincible. Thor, the mighty god of thunder, whose strength and power seemed unmatched. Bruce Banner, the brilliant scientist who was also the Hulk, a force of destruction beyond comprehension. Natasha Romanoff, the deadly Black Widow, skilled in espionage and combat. Clint Barton, the expert marksman known as Hawkeye. And Steve Rogers, the heart and soul of the team, whose leadership and sense of duty would bind them all together. In the early stages of their formation, the Avengers struggled to find common ground. The differences between them were vast, and their egos often clashed. Tony Stark, ever the cynic, was quick to question Steve's leadership, dismissing him as an outdated relic from the past. Thor, though loyal, was hesitant to trust anyone who wasn't Asgardian. Bruce Banner struggled with the anger that lay just beneath the surface, while Natasha and Clint were often torn between their loyalty to their missions and their growing connection to the team. For Steve, it was a challenge to bridge these divides. He was no longer just a soldier. He had to be a leader, a unifying force in a team that was still finding its way. But Steve never wavered in his belief that the Avengers could come together and succeed. He understood that true leadership was not about asserting dominance or control. It was about earning the respect of those around you, about making the difficult decisions and putting the needs of the team above personal ambition. As the battle against Loki's forces escalated, Steve was forced to make split-second decisions that would determine the fate of the world. The Avengers had no time to waste. Every moment was crucial, and every choice had consequences. The battle for New York was fierce, with the Avengers facing overwhelming odds as they fought to prevent the Chitauri army from taking over the city. Each member of the team had their moment to shine, showcasing their unique abilities and their commitment to the cause. Tony Stark, with his Iron Man suit, took on the skies, battling the Chitauri ships. Thor wielded his mighty hammer, Mjolnir, unleashing thunderous strikes against the alien invaders. Natasha and Clint worked together with precision and stealth, taking down enemies from the shadows. Bruce Banner, ever the reluctant hero, transformed into the Hulk when the situation demanded it, turning the tide of the battle with his raw strength and fury. But it was Steve who led them through it all, keeping the team focused and united even as chaos erupted around them. He was the constant, the steady hand that guided the Avengers through the storm. His tactical brilliance, honed through years of warfare, proved invaluable as he directed the team and made the tough calls. It wasn't just about fighting the battle, it was about knowing when to act and when to wait, when to hold the line and when to take the offensive. The pivotal moment of the battle came when Loki attempted to activate the Tesseract, opening a portal through which the Chitauri would flood the earth. With the portal open and the invasion in full swing, the Avengers had no choice but to risk everything. It was Steve who led the charge to stop Loki and seal the portal. In the final moments of the battle, it was Steve's unwavering belief in the power of teamwork that helped turn the tide. The Avengers, once a disjointed group of individuals, had become a cohesive unit, working together to defeat the enemy and protect the world. The battle ended in victory, but the cost was high. The Avengers had successfully prevented the destruction of New York and the Earth, but they had also witnessed firsthand the sacrifices required to protect what they loved. The team was forever changed by the experience, and so was Steve Rogers. He had led them through their first major battle, but he had also learned something vital. The true strength of the Avengers did not lie in any one individual. It was in their unity, in their shared sense of purpose, and in their willingness to fight for each other and for the world. As the Avengers stood victorious, Steve Rogers knew that this was just the beginning. The world was still full of dangers, and new threats would continue to emerge. But he also knew that as long as the Avengers stood together, there was no enemy they couldn't face. The fight was far from over, but now, for the first time, Steve felt truly hopeful about the future. Together, they were stronger than any force that could stand against them. The discovery that Bucky Barnes was alive was one of the most shocking and emotionally charged moments of Steve Rogers' life. For years, Steve had carried the weight of Bucky's loss, believing that his closest friend and comrade had perished during the war. The thought of losing Bucky was a wound that never fully healed, and in the darkest moments, Steve would often think about what might have been, wondering how different his life could have been if Bucky had survived. But when the truth was revealed that Bucky was not dead, but had been taken by Hydra and transformed into the Winter Soldier, Steve's heart was filled with a mixture of emotions. Shock, disbelief, and a deep sense of guilt flooded through him. How could he have not known? How could he have missed the signs? The answer was painful. Bucky had been stolen from him, his mind erased, and his identity hidden from the world. The Winter Soldier was a shadow, a man who had been broken and rebuilt into a weapon, an assassin who served Hydra without question. His memories were buried, replaced by years of brainwashing, making him a ghost of the friend Steve once knew. The man who had once been his closest companion, The one person who had stood by him through the toughest times was now a stranger, a silent killer operating under the orders of Hydra's hidden elite. For Steve, the revelation of Bucky's survival and transformation was not just a personal shock, it was a moral dilemma that challenged everything he stood for. How could he fight against the man who had been his brother in arms, the one person who had truly understood him? How could he fight someone who had no control over his actions, who had been turned into a tool of destruction by the very organization Steve had spent his life fighting against? The first confrontation between Captain America and the Winter Soldier was a brutal and painful experience. It wasn't just a fight between two opponents, it was a collision of memories, of shared history, and of love turned into grief. Steve was not just fighting to defeat the Winter Soldier, he was fighting to save Bucky, to reach the friend he had lost. Every punch, every move felt like a battle for the soul of the man he had once known, and the pain of seeing Bucky so far removed from the person he had been was almost unbearable. Yet in the midst of the violence, Steve never gave up. He refused to accept that the man he loved like a brother was gone forever. He fought with everything he had, not just as a soldier, but as a friend who believed that no matter how deep the brainwashing went, Bucky was still inside there somewhere. Steve's conviction was unwavering. He could not and would not give up on Bucky. The Winter Soldier, for his part, was a formidable opponent. He had been trained, conditioned, and honed into a deadly machine, capable of taking down even the most skilled fighters. His combat skills were unparalleled, his speed and strength enhanced by the same serum that had made Steve Captain America. But despite his power, there was still something human in Bucky's eyes. There were moments, brief flashes, when Steve could see the man he had known, the friend he had fought alongside. These moments were fleeting, but they were enough to fuel Steve's determination. As the fight continued, Steve tried everything he could to reach Bucky, to remind him of who he was. But the Winter Soldier's mind was clouded, and the trauma of his years as an assassin had buried his true self deep inside. Every time Steve tried to speak to him, to call out to the friend he had lost, the Winter Soldier only responded with violence, his mind trapped in a haze of commands and bloodshed. But despite the intensity of their battles, there were still moments of connection. Steve's persistence began to break through the walls that Hydra had built around Bucky's mind. Slowly, Steve's words began to resonate, like faint echoes of the past, until one powerful moment, when the fog lifted, Bucky's memories began to resurface, and the Winter Soldier hesitated. For the first time in years, he was confronted with the face of the man he had once been. The struggle for Bucky's soul was far from over, but Steve never lost hope. In the darkest moments, when it seemed like the Winter Soldier would remain a weapon of Hydra forever, Steve refused to give up. He understood that the process of healing would take time, that Bucky could not be freed with a single battle or a single moment of clarity. But it was enough. The seed of recognition had been planted, and the road to redemption for Bucky Barnes had begun. Over time, Steve worked with Bucky to help him rediscover who he was. It was not easy, and it was not quick, but the bond between them had never truly broken. Steve knew that Bucky's path to redemption would be difficult, full of guilt and pain, but he also knew that his friend was worth the fight. No matter what Bucky had become, no matter how many lives he had taken or how many years of his life had been stolen, Steve knew that the man he had fought alongside during the war was still in there. Through their journey together, Steve learned that true friendship and loyalty could withstand even the darkest of trials. He had never stopped believing in Bucky, even when it seemed like all hope was lost. And in the end, that belief paid off. The Winter Soldier was not just an enemy to be defeated, he was a man to be saved, a brother to be brought home. As Bucky began to regain his memories and his humanity, Steve's faith in him never wavered. The path to healing was long and difficult, but together they would face whatever challenges came their way as brothers once more. The ideological divide that split the Avengers came not from external forces, but from within, from a deep philosophical rift that tore apart the very foundations of the team. It was a conflict that went beyond politics or personal ambition. It was a clash of ideals, of what it meant to be a hero in a modern world where the lines between right and wrong were no longer as clear cut as they once had been. For Steve Rogers, the foundation of his heroism had always been about freedom, choice, and the unshakable belief that individuals had the right to make their own decisions. But now, in the face of government oversight, those very ideals were being challenged. The Sokovia Accords, a set of legal documents that required superpowered individuals to register and operate under government supervision, became the spark that ignited the rift within the Avengers. The government, in the wake of the devastating events in Sokovia and the collateral damage from numerous superhero battles, decided that the unchecked power of individuals like the Avengers needed regulation. But for Steve, this was not just a legal issue, it was a personal one. The Accords represented a loss of autonomy, a restriction on the freedom that he had fought so hard to protect. To Steve, the idea of being told when and where to act was anathema to everything he stood for. The very concept of registration was an infringement on the freedom of choice, the very right to fight for what was just, regardless of governmental interference. He had fought in a war against tyranny, against regimes that sought to control the freedom of individuals, and now it seemed like the world was heading in that same direction. How could he stand by while the government, which had often been as flawed as the systems it tried to protect, took control of the very people who had fought to protect it? On the other side of the debate stood Tony Stark, a man who had seen firsthand the destruction that unchecked superhero activity could cause. Tony had been responsible for some of the greatest technological advances in the world, but with those advances came great responsibility. His guilt over the events of Sokovia weighed heavily on him. Unlike Steve, who saw the Avengers as protectors of the people, Tony saw the need for accountability. He believed that without oversight, their actions would continue to have catastrophic consequences, and that the Accords were necessary for the long-term safety of the world. Tony, driven by his conscience and his sense of responsibility, found himself aligned with the government. He believed that the Avengers, while noble in their intentions, were too dangerous to operate without supervision. The argument for regulation seemed reasonable to him, but Steve saw it as a threat to everything they had fought for. The rift between Steve and Tony was more than just a disagreement, it was a betrayal. Both men had once been leaders, each commanding respect from their team, and now they stood on opposite sides of a moral and philosophical battlefield. It wasn't just about who was right or wrong, it was about the soul of what it meant to be a hero. Was it enough to act in the moment, to save lives, and do what was right regardless of the consequences? Or was it more important to act with the approval of those in power, to allow bureaucracy to dictate who could and could not take action? As the debate between the two leaders intensified, it quickly became clear that the rift between them was not one that could be easily bridged. The divide within the Avengers began to tear the team apart. Tony's side argued that the world needed to move forward, that they had to change with the times and accept responsibility for their actions. Steve's side argued that once they allowed the government to dictate their actions, they would lose the very freedom they had fought to protect. The division was further exacerbated by the arrival of new heroes who had their own reasons for taking a side. On Tony's side stood Black Widow and War Machine, who shared his belief that the Accords were necessary for the greater good. On Steve's side, the battle was joined by Falcon, Scarlet Witch, and the newly introduced Ant-Man, each of whom saw the Accord as a threat to their autonomy. The situation grew even more complicated when a new player entered the fray, the mysterious figure of the Winter Soldier. Bucky Barnes, once Steve's closest friend, had become a wanted fugitive. The memory of his actions as the Winter Soldier had been wiped away by Hydra, but the sins of his past were not so easily erased. Bucky's presence on Steve's side added a personal element to the already fraught debate. Steve was determined to protect Bucky, to help him overcome the trauma of his past, while Tony viewed Bucky as a dangerous criminal who could not be trusted. As the conflict escalated, it became clear that the battle would no longer be fought with words alone. The Avengers, once united by a common cause, were now divided, with each side willing to go to great lengths to defend their beliefs. The tension finally erupted in a confrontation at an airport where the two sides clashed in a battle that was as emotional as it was physical. The fight between the Avengers was brutal. Steve and Tony, once brothers in arms, now faced each other as bitter enemies. The clash between them was more than just a fight for control. It was a fight for the soul of the team, for what it meant to be a hero in a world that was rapidly changing. Steve fought to protect his friend, to defend the ideals that had guided him throughout his life. Tony fought to prevent further destruction, to ensure that the Avengers could no longer operate unchecked. The battle ended in heartbreak, with both sides fractured and their unity shattered. Steve, unable to reconcile with the Accords, went into hiding, leaving his shield behind as a symbol of his disillusionment. The Avengers were no longer a team. They had become two opposing factions, each believing that they were fighting for what was right. As Steve disappeared from the public eye, the consequences of the Civil War became clear. The Avengers were no longer a unified force for good. The world had changed, and the line between right and wrong had become more blurred than ever. Steve Rogers had fought for freedom, for justice, and for the belief that heroes should act with integrity, but in the end, even he could not escape the consequences of the division he had helped create. The days following the fracture of the Avengers were turbulent, as both sides came to terms with the consequences of their actions. While Steve Rogers and his allies regrouped, the world around them continued to face threats that no single hero could confront alone. However, for Steve, the battle was far from over. Hydra, the shadowy organization he had fought against since his days in World War II, had never truly been defeated. The seeds of Hydra's influence had been deeply embedded within SOHELD, and their reach extended beyond the walls of the secretive organization. The past would soon collide with the present, and the consequences would be profound. The revelation of Hydra's deep-rooted presence within SHI-LD was a blow to Steve Rogers. SHI-LD had always been a symbol of the protection of global peace and security, a refuge for those who sought justice. To learn that it had been infiltrated and corrupted by Hydra was a betrayal that cut deeply. For years, Steve had fought beside agents of SHIELD, trusting them with his life. Now that trust had been shattered. The very institution he had fought to protect was compromised, tainted by the insidious force of Hydra. The challenge before Steve was clear: expose Hydra's hold over the world's most powerful organizations and dismantle their network before they could unleash further chaos. The task would not be easy, for Hydra's influence stretched far beyond the confines of SHIELD. Their operatives were embedded in governments, corporations, and intelligence agencies across the globe. Their reach was vast, and their commitment to domination relentless. Steve knew that to defeat Hydra once and for all, he would need to confront not just the organization's leaders, but the legacy of Hydra's dark influence. It was not enough to destroy a few agents or take down a building. Hydra's ideology had to be eradicated at its core. This required uncovering secrets, unearthing hidden truths, and exposing the men and women who had worked in the shadows for years. The fight against Hydra would not be a battle of might alone. It would require Steve's mind, his ability to navigate the complex webs of deception and secrecy that Hydra had so carefully woven. As Steve and his allies began to uncover Hydra's secrets, they learned that the organization had been manipulating world events for decades. Hydra's influence had shaped the course of history from the darkest days of World War II to the modern conflicts that threatened global stability. They had infiltrated the highest levels of power, planting agents in positions of influence and orchestrating wars, coups, and terrorist attacks to further their goals. The Hydra agenda was not just about control, it was about creating a world where freedom was abolished and a new order based on fear and power would reign supreme. But the true depth of Hydra's reach was not fully understood until Steve uncovered a shocking secret: the existence of Project Insight. This covert Hydra initiative, which had been hidden within SHIELD's operations, was designed to use advanced technology to predict and eliminate potential threats before they could manifest. The project relied on the use of surveillance technology that monitored the global population, collecting data on every individual and analyzing their actions and behaviors. The goal was to create a world where Hydra could control everything, from the smallest dissenting voice to the largest political movements. The discovery of Project Insight was a wake-up call for Steve and his allies. They realized that they were not just fighting against Hydra's agents, they were fighting against an entire system that had been built to crush freedom and democracy. The battle had grown from one of physical confrontation to one of ideals, with the future of humanity hanging in the balance. The stakes had never been higher. Steve could no longer afford to fight Hydra in the shadows. He had to expose the organization's true nature to the world. But this was no longer just a fight between the Avengers and Hydra. It was a battle for the soul of the planet. Hydra's control over the world's systems, its manipulation of politics and power, had to be stopped, not just for the survival of Steve's team, but for the future of all those who still believed in freedom, in justice, and in the right to live without fear. The final confrontation came when Steve, with the help of the remaining Avengers, managed to infiltrate Hydra's base of operations. It was there that they faced off against the most dangerous of Hydra's leaders, including the enigmatic Baron Strucker, the mastermind behind Project Insight. The battle was fierce, but Steve was relentless. He knew that every strike he delivered was a step closer to dismantling the Hydra network, to freeing the world from its grasp. But even in the face of victory, Steve knew that the fight would never truly end. Hydra's ideology had not been eradicated with the defeat of their leaders. Their influence would continue to ripple through the world's systems, and the scars of their actions would be felt for generations to come. For Steve, the war against Hydra was not just about defeating their agents or destroying their bases. It was about protecting the ideals that Hydra had tried to crush. It was about preserving the freedom to choose, to speak, and to act without fear of surveillance or oppression. In the end, the victory over Hydra was bittersweet. Steve had uncovered the truth, destroyed the organization's hold over SHIELD, and exposed their plans to the world. But the damage had already been done. The global balance of power had been shifted, and the trust that had once been placed in SHIELD and the Avengers had been shaken. Steve knew that the fight for freedom and justice was ongoing, and that new challenges would always emerge. But even as the world faced new threats, Steve Rogers remained steadfast in his belief that no matter how dark the world became, there would always be those who would rise to fight for what was right. And for as long as he had breath in his body, Captain America would be one of those heroes, standing as a beacon of hope in a world that needed it more than ever. As the years passed, the world Steve Rogers had fought to protect faced a new and unimaginable threat. The rise of Thanos, a cosmic warlord whose power was as vast as the universe itself. Thanos was unlike any enemy Captain America had ever faced. He was not just a man or a nation to be defeated. He was a force of nature bent on obtaining the 6 Infinity Stones, powerful artifacts capable of bending the very fabric of reality to his will. With the stones in his possession, Thanos sought to erase half of all life in the universe, believing that balance could only be achieved through destruction. The Avengers, once a united team, had now been torn apart. The Civil War had left deep scars, and Steve, who had once led them, was no longer the undisputed leader of the team. Tony Stark, with his brilliance and resources, had taken a different approach, one that relied more on technology and strategy. Steve, however, remained steadfast in his belief that true heroism came from the heart, from the willingness to make sacrifices for the greater good. But the stakes were higher than they had ever been before. The Earth was no longer just in danger from Hydra or terrorists. It was facing an extinction-level event that would affect every living being across the cosmos. The journey to stop Thanos began with a search for the Infinity Stones, each of which was hidden across the universe, and each of which required incredible effort, strategy, and sacrifice to retrieve. Steve found himself once again leading a ragtag team of heroes, old and new, as they hunted down these stones to prevent Thanos from achieving his goal. Along the way, they faced trials and tribulations, both physical and emotional, as they sought the power to save the universe from annihilation. Each step of the journey felt more personal than the last. Steve's leadership, once the foundation of the Avengers, was now tested in ways that pushed him to his limits. The weight of the universe rested on their shoulders, and the sacrifices they would have to make were not just theoretical. They were real, and they were painful. The first stone they sought was the Power Stone, which had been hidden on the planet Xandar. In the battle to retrieve it, Steve, along with Star-Lord, Gamora, and Drax, faced the fierce reality of just how powerful Thanos' forces were. Xandar was devastated in the process, and despite their best efforts, the Avengers were unable to stop Thanos from taking the stone. It was the first sign that the stakes were far greater than they had imagined. The next stone was the Space Stone, which was hidden inside the Tesseract. This took the Avengers to the farthest reaches of space, where they confronted new and deadly enemies, but they were ultimately unable to stop Thanos from taking it. As the team grew more fractured and desperate, they sought the Time Stone, the Mind Stone, and finally the Soul Stone. Each stone came at a cost, a sacrifice that weighed heavily on Steve's heart. It was on the journey to retrieve the Soul Stone that Steve encountered his greatest emotional challenge. The Soul Stone demanded a sacrifice, a soul for a soul. In a heart-wrenching moment of realization, Gamora, Thanos' adopted daughter, was thrown to her death in order for Thanos to acquire the stone. The pain of this loss haunted Steve, as it reminded him of his own losses, his battles with grief and sacrifice, the very essence of what it meant to be a hero. As the Avengers closed in on the last two stones, the Infinity Gauntlet began to take shape, its power growing stronger with every stone Thanos acquired. Steve's resolve remained unwavering, but the burden of leadership and responsibility grew heavier with each passing day. In the final confrontation, Steve and the Avengers faced Thanos head-on, knowing that this would be their greatest battle, not just for Earth, but for all of existence. But despite their best efforts, the Avengers could not stop Thanos from completing the Infinity Gauntlet. With the snap of his fingers, Thanos wiped out half of all life in the universe, leaving the remaining heroes to pick up the pieces. Steve, along with Tony, Natasha, Bruce, and the others, was left to mourn the losses of those who had been taken, friends, allies, and loved ones. The world they had fought to protect was now broken. The Avengers regrouped, devastated by the loss. It was in this darkest moment that Steve's true leadership was tested. The world had changed irrevocably, and the Avengers had failed. Yet Steve refused to accept defeat. He knew that there was still a chance to undo what had been done, to find a way to bring back those they had lost. The team's journey to recover the lost stones and undo Thanos' snap was a battle unlike any other. But it was not just about reversing the damage. It was about finding hope in a universe that had been nearly destroyed. The fight against Thanos reached its apex when the Avengers, working together, managed to retrieve the stones from various timelines and bring them together in one final confrontation. Steve, Tony, and Natasha, along with the others, fought their way to the climactic battle, culminating in an epic showdown with Thanos. The stakes had never been higher. It was a battle not just for their survival, but for the very future of all life in the universe. In the final moments, with the Infinity Stones in his grasp, Tony Stark made the ultimate sacrifice. He wielded the power of the gauntlet to reverse the destruction caused by Thanos, but in doing so, he paid the price with his life. It was a moment of immense loss, but it was also a moment of redemption. Tony's sacrifice proved that in the end, it was not just strength or power that saved the universe, but the willingness to sacrifice everything for the greater good. With Thanos defeated and the stones returned to their rightful places, the Avengers had done what many thought impossible. The universe had been saved, but at a tremendous cost. The finality of Tony's death was felt deeply by Steve, as the loss of his friend, his fellow Avenger, left a hole in his heart that would never fully heal. But through their sacrifice, Steve understood what it meant to be a hero. It was not about glory or fame, it was about doing what was right, no matter the cost. The Avengers had saved the universe, but the cost was unimaginable. Tony Stark, the genius who had helped bring together the team, the man who had sacrificed everything to make sure that life would continue, was gone. Steve Rogers, the heart of the Avengers, stood among his teammates, but there was an emptiness in his chest that no victory could fill. The final battle had taken so much from them. Tony's sacrifice had been the pinnacle of heroism, but it had also left the team broken, the weight of their losses too much to bear. In the wake of their victory over Thanos, the Avengers faced not only the challenge of rebuilding their team, but also the challenge of rebuilding the world that had been shattered by so much destruction. For Steve, the path forward was unclear. He had always fought for something larger than himself, always driven by a sense of duty to protect the world from forces beyond its control. But with Tony gone, with so much pain and loss in the rearview mirror, Steve was unsure where he fit in this new reality. The Avengers, as a team, were no longer the unified force they once were. Each member was dealing with their own grief, their own loss. Steve had always been the leader, the one who steadied the team in the darkest of times. But now, even he found himself at a loss, uncertain of the role he was meant to play in a world without Tony Stark and without the clear-cut battles of the past. But despite the emotional toll of their victory, Steve knew one thing. His journey was far from over. Captain America's shield, once a symbol of strength, honor, and sacrifice, had been left behind in the final moments of their battle with Thanos. Tony's last act, using the Infinity Stones to undo Thanos' devastation, had ultimately resulted in his death, and Steve, overwhelmed by grief, had passed on his shield. For Steve, that shield was more than just a weapon. It was the symbol of everything he had fought for. It represented his ideals, his duty, and his loyalty to those he cared about. But now, with Tony gone, the time had come for Steve to reassess what it meant to be Captain America. The weight of the shield, which had once been so familiar to him, felt distant now. In the aftermath of the battle, Steve retreated, quietly stepping away from the mantle of Captain America and the Avengers, taking the time to reflect on the path that had led him to this moment. The universe had been saved, but Steve found that in many ways he was at a crossroads. He had spent so many years fighting, leading, and sacrificing. But now, after everything that had happened, he wasn't sure who he was without the shield, without the role of Captain America. It was in these quiet moments of reflection that Steve found himself wrestling with a choice. The world had moved on, and there were new heroes emerging to fill the void left by the Avengers. The world needed a symbol, but it also needed someone who could guide it, someone who could help heal the wounds left by years of conflict. It was not just about returning the shield to its rightful place, but about finding a way to move forward in a world that was more fractured than ever. As the years passed, Steve found his place in this new world. He settled into a quieter life, away from the front lines of battle, and began to pass on his wisdom to the next generation of heroes. But the shield and the legacy of Captain America was never far from his mind. The burden of that legacy was something that Steve carried with him every day, but he knew that he had to let go of the past in order to move forward. It was then, when Steve least expected it, that he was called back into the fold. The world once again found itself in need of heroes. The remnants of Hydra and new threats that had emerged in the wake of Thanos' defeat began to stir. The universe was healing, but its scars were still fresh, and with those scars came new dangers. Steve's heart told him that it was time for him to return to the front lines. The world needed Captain America once again. But when the time came to reclaim his shield, Steve made a choice. It wasn't just about taking up the mantle of Captain America again. It was about choosing who would carry that mantle forward. In a moment of clarity, Steve realized that his role as Captain America was not tied to the shield alone. It was tied to the values he had fought for, the values of hope, freedom, and justice. The shield was a symbol, yes, but the spirit of Captain America lived within him, within every decision, every sacrifice, and every choice to do what was right. Steve decided to pass on the shield, but not to someone who simply shared his strength or his powers. He passed it on to someone who shared his heart, someone who understood the weight of what it meant to be Captain America. Sam Wilson, the Falcon, was more than just a teammate. He was a man who had walked beside Steve through the darkest moments, a man who understood the burden of heroism. Sam had earned the right to wield the shield, not just because of his abilities, but because of his character. In a quiet, emotional moment, Steve entrusted Sam with the shield, knowing that the legacy of Captain America would live on in someone who was just as worthy. It wasn't just a passing of the shield, but a passing of the torch. The world had changed, and the role of Captain America would evolve with it. But the ideals that Steve had stood for would remain unchanged. And so, Steve Rogers, having fought countless battles, having lost friends and comrades, having led with courage and sacrifice, finally found peace. He understood that the mantle of Captain America was not his to keep forever. It was a symbol of hope, of sacrifice, and of the will to fight for what was right. And that symbol, that spirit, would live on in Sam Wilson, as it had lived on in Steve, as it would continue to live on in the hearts of those who chose to make a difference. The shield passed from one hand to another, but Captain America's legacy was never truly bound to the shield alone. The true power of Captain America lay not in his enhanced strength, nor in his iconic shield, but in his heart. From the very beginning, Steve Rogers had been a symbol of the very best of humanity: courage, honor, sacrifice, and unwavering moral conviction. As the world changed, so too did the nature of the threats and the roles that heroes were called to play. But one thing remained constant. The ideals that Steve Rogers had embodied for so long continued to inspire, to drive the next generation of heroes to rise and protect the innocent. For Steve, passing the shield to Sam Wilson wasn't just a decision to transfer responsibility, it was a gesture of deep faith in the future. Sam had earned the trust of Steve, not because of his physical abilities or his combat skills, though those were immense, but because of the integrity he had shown, the strength of his character, and his ability to make difficult decisions, just as Steve had. The decision was deeply emotional for Steve, for it marked the end of an era, but it also marked the beginning of something new, something hopeful. Sam Wilson, once the Falcon, was now Captain America. He carried the weight of that title with pride, knowing that it was not just about wearing the shield, it was about upholding the ideals of justice, freedom, and the belief that anyone, no matter their background, could rise to be a hero. Sam understood that the shield was a symbol of hope, and he was ready to carry that torch forward. As Captain America's legacy continued through Sam, Steve Rogers found peace in knowing that the values he had fought for were alive and well. He had given everything he could to protect the world, to ensure that future generations would not have to face the same darkness he had fought against. But even as he stepped away from active duty, he knew his work was not done. The legacy of Captain America would live on through the people he had inspired, through Sam, and through every person who chose to stand for what was right, no matter the cost. Steve's final act was one of quiet reflection, not on his own achievements, but on the impact he had made. He had never been driven by the need for recognition. His actions had always been rooted in a deep sense of duty and a desire to protect those who could not protect themselves. In his eyes, true heroism wasn't about the battles won or the victories celebrated. It was about making the hard choices, the sacrifices that often went unnoticed for the greater good. In the years that followed, Steve Rogers became more of a symbol than ever. His name became synonymous with the ideals he had fought for: freedom, equality, and the belief that one person could make a difference. Though he had stepped away from the world of active duty, Steve remained a quiet guiding force, offering wisdom when needed and ensuring that the next generation of heroes would understand that being a hero meant much more than just having powers or fighting battles. The world had changed drastically since Steve's time as a soldier. The Avengers were no longer just a team of heroes. They had become a global network, with new faces joining the fight for justice. But despite these changes, the spirit of the team, the bond they shared, the belief that they were stronger together than apart, remained unchanged. The ideals of Captain America lived on in each of them, from Sam Wilson to the new heroes who would rise to face the challenges of the future. Steve's legacy was not confined to his time as Captain America. It was woven into the very fabric of the world he had fought to protect. His actions had inspired countless others to rise up and take a stand, to make their own sacrifices for the greater good. The world would always need heroes, but it would also need those who understood the true cost of heroism, the willingness to sacrifice, to fight not for glory, but for justice. The mantle of Captain America which Steve had once worn so proudly, had now passed on to Sam, but the lessons of the past would continue to guide the heroes of tomorrow. Steve had never sought fame or recognition, but he had found something far more meaningful: the knowledge that his actions had inspired others to be better, to do better, and to fight for a world where freedom and justice were not just ideals, but realities. Steve's journey was not one defined by victory or conquest. It was defined by the lives he had touched, the hearts he had inspired, and the world he had fought to protect. His legacy was not built on the battles he had won, but on the countless small acts of heroism that had defined his life. It was in every decision to do the right thing, even when the odds were against him. It was in every person who stood up and said, "I will fight for what is right," because of the example Steve Rogers had set. As the world continued to face new challenges, Steve Rogers knew that the true measure of a hero was not in how many battles they fought, but in how they left the world better than they had found it. And in that sense, Captain America had done more than just protect the world from threats. He had shown the world what it meant to stand for something greater than yourself, to fight for justice, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The torch had been passed, and the future was bright. Captain America's legacy was secure, not because of the shield or the title, but because of the spirit that had defined Steve Rogers' life. A spirit that would live on in Sam Wilson, in the New Avengers, and in every hero who chose to fight for the values Steve had upheld. The story of Steve Rogers, Captain America, is not merely a story of strength, power, or glory. It is a story of the heart, a heart that led him to do what was right, no matter the cost. What truly defined Steve as a hero wasn't his ability to lift his shield or his physical transformation into the super soldier, but his unwavering belief in the power of doing good, even when the world around him seemed to turn dark. Steve's heart was his greatest weapon, for it was a heart that could not be corrupted, a heart that held onto the truth of right and wrong when so many others had lost sight of it. In the darkest days of war, when the weight of the world seemed to crush him, Steve never wavered in his convictions. Guess was not a man driven by the need for fame or recognition. He was a man who had experienced personal loss, seen firsthand the cost of war, and understood the true meaning of sacrifice. It was his ability to act with compassion, to recognize the humanity in others, and to fight for those who could not fight for themselves that made Steve Rogers truly heroic. Even when he was frozen in ice for decades, when he was thrust into a world that was beyond recognition, his heart remained steadfast, a beacon in a world that had changed in ways he could not fully comprehend. Steve's greatest strength, as Captain America, was his ability to see the bigger picture, to understand that heroism was not about individual feats or glory, but about standing up for the oppressed, about creating a world where freedom and justice could flourish. For Steve, being a hero meant not just defeating the enemy, but offering the world a vision of what could be. It was a vision built on the belief that no matter how dark the world seemed, there was always hope. It was the understanding that every small act of kindness, every choice to stand up for what was right, made a difference in shaping the world for the better. The heart of the hero was not just in Steve's capacity to fight, it was in his capacity to forgive, to heal, and to inspire. In his battle against Hydra, in his journey to reunite with Bucky, in his willingness to fight for what was right, even when the world had become fractured. Steve's heart never hardened. It never became jaded or cynical. He remained compassionate and understanding, knowing that even the greatest of villains could be redeemed, that even the darkest of moments could lead to light. It was this belief in redemption that set Steve apart from so many other heroes. In the midst of his battles, he never stopped believing in the goodness of others. Whether it was his commitment to saving Bucky from the Winter Soldier persona that Hydra had molded him into, or his unwavering belief in the future of the Avengers, despite their fractures, Steve's heart always led him to act with the conviction that there was always a way to choose the right path, no matter how difficult or painful. The story of Steve's relationship with Bucky Barnes exemplified this heart of a hero. When Steve first learned that Bucky was alive, but a mere shadow of the man he had once known, he could have easily given up, abandoned the hope that his friend could ever be redeemed. After all, Bucky had committed unspeakable acts under Hydra's control, but Steve's heart, his unyielding belief in friendship and loyalty, led him to pursue the man he once called his brother. Through every battle, every moment of uncertainty, Steve never gave up on Bucky. He fought not just to save him from Hydra's grasp, but to remind him of who he was before the darkness took over. It was in this struggle to save his friend that Steve proved that the heart of a hero was not just in how one fought, but in how one loved, forgave, and refused to give up on others, no matter the odds. Even as Captain America, Steve's path was not one of invincibility. He too was human, a man who struggled, who faced doubt, and who bore the scars of his past. His heart was not just a symbol of hope for others, it was a source of strength for himself, a reminder of why he fought and what he fought for. His heart was what allowed him to face the most difficult of choices, whether it was standing up to the government in the face of the Sokovia Accords or leading the Avengers against Thanos, the greatest threat the universe had ever known. Steve's heart was what gave him the courage to lead, to sacrifice, and to rise above even the most overwhelming challenges. His legacy was not just built on the victories he achieved, but on the values he instilled in others. The heart of the hero, as Steve demonstrated, was rooted in a willingness to fight for something greater than oneself. It was about believing in the possibility of change, in the power of redemption, and in the enduring hope that no matter how difficult the path, the light of what was right could never be extinguished. And it was that heart, that spirit of undying hope, that passed down through the generations of heroes who followed in Steve's footsteps. It was this heart that Sam Wilson, the new Captain America, would carry forward, not just as a shield-wielding warrior, but as a symbol of hope, unity, and justice in a world that needed it more than ever. Sam's leadership would not just be a continuation of Steve's, but a new chapter in the legacy of Captain America, a legacy built on the belief that every individual has the power to choose to do what is right, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Steve Rogers, the heart of Captain America, had always known that his greatest power lay not in his strength, but in his ability to inspire others, to give them hope, and to show them that even in the darkest times, there was always a reason to believe in a better future. And as Sam Wilson now stepped into the mantle of Captain America, that heart, that spirit, would continue to shine brightly. The journey of Steve Rogers, of Captain America, was not one of individual victories or personal triumphs. It was a journey of collective sacrifice, of standing for something greater than oneself, of fighting for freedom and justice in a world that was often harsh and unforgiving. As the world continued to change and evolve, so too did the legacy of Captain America, a legacy that would live on in the hearts of all those who believed in the power of heroism, courage, and hope. In the final chapters of his life, Steve Rogers had done more than just fight battles. He had reshaped the very essence of what it meant to be a hero. His life had been marked by choices, choices to stand tall in the face of adversity, to lead with integrity, and to make sacrifices that would ensure the future was better than the past. He had been a soldier, a leader, and a friend, but above all, he had been a symbol of the enduring power of goodness. Now, in the quiet moments of his life, Steve was left to reflect on all that he had given and all that he had lost. The world had moved forward, and Steve had passed on the mantle of Captain America to a new generation. But the lessons he had taught, the values he had instilled in those who came after him, would live on forever. The shield may have been passed on, but the heart of Captain America, the spirit of hope, of standing for what is right no matter the cost, would never fade. As Steve looked back on his journey, he knew that he had lived a life of purpose. He had fought for the ideals that he believed in, and in doing so, had become more than just a symbol. He had become a legacy, a reminder to all who would listen that heroism was not about power or fame, but about doing the right thing, even when the world seemed to have lost its way. The heart of Captain America was not in his shield or his superhuman strength. It was in his heart, a heart that never wavered, that never faltered, even in the darkest of times. It was a heart that had seen loss, that had witnessed the cruelty of the world, but still believed in the possibility of change. Steve Rogers had lived a life of service, of sacrifice, and of love for those he had fought to protect. And now, as his journey came to a close, he could rest easy knowing that his legacy was secure. In the years to come, those who had known Steve would carry on his work. The Avengers and the new heroes who emerged to take their place would continue to fight for justice, for the freedom that Steve had believed in. And in their hearts, they would carry the lessons of Steve Rogers, the lessons of Captain America, that no matter how difficult the road, no matter how dark the night, there was always a reason to stand up, to fight for what was right, and to never give up. Steve's journey had come to an end, but his story was far from over. His spirit lived on in every hero who chose to fight for justice, in every person who believed that they could make a difference in the world. And as the sun set on Steve's time as Captain America, the world continued to turn, knowing that just as Captain America had always stood tall in the face of danger, there would always be heroes ready to rise and protect the ideals that made the world worth fighting for. Thank you, Captain America, for showing us the true meaning of heroism, for reminding us that the greatest strength lies not in our muscles, but in our hearts. May your legacy continue to inspire, to guide, and to remind us all that no matter what challenges we face, we can always find the courage to stand for what is right. Thank you for drifting with me tonight through the incredible journey of Captain America. May your dreams be filled with peace, strength, and the enduring spirit of a hero who fought for what was right, no matter the cost. As the world sleeps, let us remember the heart of Captain America, the courage to stand up, the willingness to sacrifice, and the hope that we can always choose to do what is right. Good night, and may your rest be as heroic as the legacy of Steve Rogers.